God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. The poet W.H. Auden once said that among those whom I like or admire, I can find no common denominator. But among those whom I love, I can. All of them make me laugh. In the book of Genesis, God is the one who brings laughter. It's a gift that moves beyond the delays of the past without explaining them. Instead, laughter rises above them to a newfound delight in the present. As we turn to the next section of the story, though, we find an episode that is anything but funny. In Genesis chapter 22, God tells Abraham to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. It's a disturbing story that is filled with contradictions. Up to this point in the life of Abraham and his family, God has been the giver who has given Isaac to Abraham and Sarah, even though it seemed impossible. But now God demands that Abraham give Isaac back as a burnt offering, a sacrifice that would end Isaac's life. So now it's God's demand that seems impossible. The story is told with remarkable economy of style. There's only the bare plot, with a little conversation and much ambiguity. The opening line says that God makes this demand to test Abraham, and we wonder why. After all, God has already called Abraham away from his ancestral home and made him wait for decades for Isaac to be born. Abraham has already endured all of that, so why test Abraham again? No answer is given. Instead, there's simply the command, which unfolds in excruciating detail. God says, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, the one whom you love." With every word, you can sense the importance that Isaac has for Abraham. Isaac is God's promised child, Abraham's beloved child. So it is horrifying when God now tells Abraham to go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. To sacrifice a child seems unconscionable. We would expect Abraham to object. After all, he's talked back to God before. But this time, Abraham says nothing. Instead, there's an eerie silence as he takes his donkey, gathers the wood for the burnt offering, and sets out with Isaac and 2 other young men. On the 3rd day, he sees the mountain in the distance. So he tells the young men to stay behind with the donkey, while he and Isaac go on alone, on foot. As they walk, Isaac carries the wood for the sacrifice, while Abraham brings the fire and the knife. We as readers know the horrible command that Abraham has been given, but Isaac does not. So he innocently asks his father where they will get the lamb for the sacrifice. And Abraham tells him that God himself will provide the lamb. We have to wonder what Abraham means by that. Is he alluding to the fact that God has given Isaac to him so that in a sense God is providing the sacrifice? Or is he dissembling to hide the truth from his son? Or does he really think God will do the unexpected and that somehow Isaac will be spared? The text provides no clarity. The narrator tells us nothing more about what Abraham is thinking. Instead, the plot moves on to the critical moment itself. An ancient artist tried to capture the drama when designing a mosaic floor for a 5th century synagogue. The artist pictures Abraham with the knife in one hand and Isaac in the other. The altar is ablaze with fire in the background. Isaac's life is hanging in the balance. But at that moment, God intervenes, In the biblical text, it's the voice of an angel. In the Mosaic, it's the hand of God stretching down from above. And the artist displays the Hebrew words, al tishlach, don't do it. Because in the text, God says, don't stretch out your hand against the boy. God stops the horrific process at the last possible moment. And Abraham sees a ram caught in a thicket, so he sacrifices the ram in place of his son Isaac. The story ends well, yet disputes about its meaning are profound. Throughout the centuries, many Christian and Jewish interpreters have taken this to mean that Abraham exemplifies the virtue of obedience. The story shows that he's willing to do whatever God requires without wavering. Some also emphasize Isaac's obedience, suggesting that Isaac too is a role model because he's willing to become a martyr. But in the 18th century, the philosopher Immanuel Kant disagreed. He insisted that Abraham should have refused because the moral law is clear. You do not take the life of your son. If Abraham thought God was telling him something different, he should have dismissed it as irrational. For Kant, no divine command could violate the moral law. Later, the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard took issue with that approach in a work called Fear and Trembling. In it, he tried to probe the torment that Abraham experienced in a situation that could not be comprehended in the usual categories. For Kierkegaard, the sheer incongruity of the story showed that human relationships to God ultimately go beyond ordinary reasoning. What strikes me about the story is the extent to which God's ways are inscrutable here. God puts Abraham in a situation that defies easy answers. For Abraham to disobey God would usually be considered wrong, but to be told to sacrifice Isaac also seems wrong. It runs counter to everything else Abraham knows about God. Yet what we find is that despite the inscrutable command, God remains true to his own character in the end. The story climaxes when God demonstrates that his desire is finally that Isaac live and not die, so that as readers we take the story as a whole. In it, the most mysterious figure is God, whose ways are deeply hidden and seem fraught with contradiction. God's purposes cannot always be discerned along the way. They're finally known in the end, where the drama culminates in the preservation of life. As we come to the conclusion of the story of Abraham, there's a scene in chapter 23 that highlights the paradox of it all. Here we learn that Sarah has died and Abraham needs a place to bury her. He's near the town of Hebron in the southern part of Canaan. So he goes to the Hittite people who are there. He tells them, I'm a foreigner and an alien residing among you. Give me some property for a grave among you so I can bury my dead. The paradox is that at the beginning of the lecture, we heard that Abraham was given the promise of land. That was the reason he left home. But at this point, we're reminded that he never did acquire any land. He's lived in Canaan for years, but he's still a foreigner, a resident alien. And the first piece of property he will own is a cave in which to bury his wife. He negotiates with the Hittites for a cave in one of their fields. And when they agree on a price, he pays it, and that's where he places Sarah's body, in the cave at Hebron. It all seems so anticlimactic. Remember that the descendants of Abraham and Sarah were to be as countless as the stars, but together they had just one son, Isaac. He's the solitary thread on which the continuation of that promise now depends. In chapter 24, Abraham sends a servant back to Haran, the place from which he set out at the start, and the servant does bring back a wife for Isaac, so the story will continue into the next generation. But having just one child with Sarah seems far short of the grand vision that Abraham was given earlier. From our vantage point as readers, we can see that Abraham's legacy has in fact been profound. The way he's now known around the globe and is